Welcome to today's review session. Today we're going to cover 3 areas of neurodevelopment. I'm going to go as quickly as I can through the material. If you want more detailed information, you can get that by watching the more in-depth explorations of these areas in the earlier recordings in this playlist. So, quick review of terminology again. Neurodevelopment, what we're talking about is the brain's development and the way that it's wired, the way that it works, the way that it processes information. So basically the way that we experience the world, how we input and output. A neurotype is a person's unique way of thinking, learning, and communicating, and that's determined by the way their brain has developed. So it's determined by their neurodevelopment. Neurotypical, also known as the predominant neurotype or being neuronormative, that's when a person thinks, processes information, and behaves in a way that's typical or expected within their culture. So our society, our culture is set up to support the needs of neurotypical people, which is why it seems like they don't have any additional needs, because we've already set things up to work for those people. A neurodivergent person is a person whose brain has developed in a way that results in them thinking, processing information, and behaving differently to societal expectations. So it's a brain that has developed in a way that is not supported by the way society is set up to function. And so this results in different support strategies needing to be put in place in order to support those the needs of those brains. Neurodiversity is a group of people with mixed neurotypes, so neurotypical and neurodivergent. It is not to be used interchangeably with neurodivergent. They are not the same thing. So just to expand upon that, it's like cupcakes. Neurotypical cupcakes are vanilla cupcakes. All the other cupcakes are different flavors. So you can have chocolate, strawberry, red forest cake. I can't think of any others right now. But the vanilla all on its own is neurotypical. Having neurotypical thrown in with a bunch of other flavors would be neurodiverse. If it's all chocolate cupcakes, it is not neurodiverse, even though those cupcakes are not neurotypical. The 6 areas of development that we discuss when we're talking about neurodevelopment are cognitive, sensory, emotional, communication, motor, and social. Today we're doing a review of those top 3, and then next week we will start on communication and working our way through those. This is the profile wheel again. This is why we're here today, because we're trying to understand these areas of development as they relate to using the Neurodevelopmental Profile Wheel more effectively to support young people in schools and at home. So what we're going to be looking for is external behavior, which is the observable evidence that we can gather to put into the form, that to then try to look at that holistically, look at all of that information and try to understand what the internal unmet need is that's driving that behavior. These areas of development are the same areas that are looked at in an NDOS assessment, but this is not a part of the NDOS assessment. The profile wheel is specifically for looking at how can we support this individual child's unmet needs. And that graphic from NeuroWild is, I think, really a perfect explanation of what we're talking about here. We can only see the top. What we're trying to get to is what's underneath that, so that we can understand why the plant has grown the way it has. So like why we're seeing this behavior that we're seeing, it's directly related to the root system underneath. Okay, so how do we use this wheel? Well, first and foremost, we need to be using it as a team. We can't be doing this in isolation. Everybody needs to be on the same page. So everybody in a caring circle needs to be working together to complete this wheel. And what we need to be capturing first is the child's view of their situation, and we need to always be centering their voice, which is why the My World Triangle sits at the center of the profile wheel. We want to make sure that we're looking at this child's, all parts of this child's life. This isn't just, well, at home they are fine, but at school they're disruptive and we need to figure out how to fix school. What we're needing to look at is what in all around in this child's life needs support, and put it in place so that they can get the most out of their life in all areas of their life. And very importantly, that children and families must be fully included in these discussions. These aren't things that we're doing to children or saying to them, this is what you're going to do now. This is a collaborative process. Okay, so jumping into the nitty gritty. For the cognitive development, and this is just a quick review from what we went through a few weeks ago. Cognitive development is the process that allows us to acquire, organize, and learn to use knowledge. And very specifically, this includes our memory, problem solving, reasoning, executive functioning, and self-regulation. This is our higher brain function, basically. This is what allows us to make a reasonable decision and to look at all the evidence and be logical about it. But without it, we also can't regulate our emotions. We can't remember what we were supposed to be doing. We have difficulty socializing with people if we don't have a basic understanding of what that is supposed to look like and mean. So cognitive development does a lot of stuff, and it is really the foundation that everything else sits on. Particularly, I'm going to speak about executive functioning and self-regulation because when it comes to using the profile wheel, these are the kinds of things that we're most likely to be able to observe, our external evidence that we can observe to collect into the wheel. So executive functioning and self-regulation are the skills that enable us to plan, focus attention, remember instructions, and juggle multiple tasks. And this is our day-to-day living stuff, our decision-making and our self-management. So executive function is made up of 3 types of brain function: working memory, inhibitory control, and mental flexibility. It's important to note that executive functioning is not innate. It's not just something that you get there eventually. It's developed through experience and through observation. There are stages to this development also. So obviously we're not going to expect a newborn infant to be able to make a logical decision about something, right? That's just not where their brain is. And so we have to also respect what those stages of development are. These skills do grow rapidly from birth to 5 to 6, when our brain is doing its most of its growth to kind of like figure out our place in the world. And this is the prefrontal cortex development. At adolescence, there's another spike in development. And then it's also at that stage that a neurotypical brain will experience a pruning of the connections that are not regularly used in order to solidify the skills that are regularly used. But what's important to note is that neurodivergent brains do not prune in the same way that neurotypical brains do. And so there's this, actually, if you look online, you'll see a lot of the wording is very medical deficit based, where it says, well, it's just that neurodivergent brains aren't efficient. And I'm going to counteract that straight up, because it's not that it isn't efficient or that it's doing it wrong. It's that it's doing it differently. And there's nothing wrong with the way that it's doing it. It's just that we have to understand that so we can try to understand where that person is coming from. And what we do know about executive functioning that's important is that we need these skills in order to manage daily life. If we have a lot of significant stress early on when we're developing these skills, it compromises that development. But children who have strong executive functioning skills are more likely to effectively manage stress. So we have to make sure that we're providing a space that allows neurodivergent people to feel safe, to develop in the way that is right for them without additional stresses and pressures, so that their long-term ability to manage stress and life isn't compromised. So what would it look like if there was executive function support need? If a young person is needing some support in this area, you might see that they're distressed by a change in a routine, and certainly if it comes up unexpectedly or if it's a change they've never experienced before. Difficulty in starting a task or activity, so getting themselves organized to get that task going. Having difficulty with completing homework assignments, impulsively interrupting in conversations in class, or even kind of looking out the window and daydreaming, rather than being kind of actively involved in the class discussion. A big one that has certainly impacted my family is dashing through traffic without looking for danger, only because something on the other side has caught their attention. So they have completely blanked out the immediate threat, if you will. What they're seeing on the other side is what's important, and that's what they're going to. And this is why my children still require me to put hands on their shoulders when we're walking anywhere near a road. Needing prompts to move from one activity to another, diving straight in without doing any planning, distress when being interrupted, when engrossed in an activity. That's definitely a big one for me. And difficulty being friends with more than one person at a time, because it's hard to manage all those, to understand all those expectations. This is just a generic list of that, and there will be more than this, but it kind of gives you an idea of what we're talking about, that what we're looking for. So the key takeaways from our cognitive development: it underpins all other areas of neurodevelopment. It includes executive function and self-regulation, and it's made up of working memory, inhibitory control, and mental cognitive flexibility. And these skills impact our organization, our impulse control, our problem solving, our flexibility of thought, and our attention control. So being able to attain, sustain, and switch. Okay, now we're going to move on to emotion. So the science of emotion. Our emotional response is controlled by the limbic system, which is connected to the brainstem. And it's made up of the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, and the limbic cortex. Each of those systems have a different role in emotional response. I'm going to focus on the amygdala, because the amygdala is what controls our feelings of fear, anxiety, and anger. And the amygdala works as a purely survival response. It assesses for environmental threats and looks to trigger us when we need to be kept safe. So it's basically making us aware of all the dangers environmentally around us. And why does that matter in terms of neurodevelopmental areas of emotion? Because if we're always searching for environmental threats, if our brain is programmed through enough experience to think that there's threats everywhere, we're not going to be able to do anything but look for threats, because the amygdala literally shuts down the prefrontal cortex. So I was just speaking about the prefrontal cortex in cognitive. That's the area that allows us to reason, to inhibit our immediate kind of response, right? Our impulse control, to plan and all of those things. And the amygdala literally shuts that down. So if we're always looking for our environmental threats, if we're primed for that, then we lose our ability to use our cognitive skills. The prefrontal cortex provides the ability to reason, plan, and control, as I just said. This is where executive function is based. And so the amygdala is at direct odds with the prefrontal cortex. You will know of this. You'll have heard it's called the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. And when it's triggered, when it takes over our prefrontal cortex, this is known as amygdala hijack. The different areas of emotional development that we need to be aware of in terms of what we're looking for as appropriate in a young person that we're trying to support are our intrapersonal skills and our interpersonal skills. Emotional development is a staged process. It is complex. It's involving the environment. Just like with the cognitive, there's a lot going on. It comes in stages, and also requires that experience in order to develop fully. But first, our brain is working on understanding ourself. So in our intrapersonal skills, it's looking at our self-awareness and our self-management and trying to understand, what is my body telling me? Like, what am I feeling? What am I thinking? And trying to understand ourselves and understanding basic emotions like anger, happiness. Later on, we're looking at frustration, disappointment, the confusion of romantic feelings, and we're working on how to manage all of those things in order to regulate our own behavior to different contexts and with different people. And obviously, that's a complex thing that's going on there. And again, we're not going to expect a 1-year-old to be able to manage the kinds of things emotionally that we would expect a 15-year-old to be able to manage, because we recognize that there is a staged, multifaceted approach there to that development. We also are working on interpersonal emotional development, and this is our awareness of others and how we relate to them. And at a certain stage, like in our later primary years, this is when we start to really think about something from another person's perspective, trying to understand what their emotional needs are, and where we talk about empathy. So our emotional development is responsible for self-awareness, social awareness, emotional regulation, logical decision making, being able to make logical and constructive decisions. So how we're managing our emotions to allow our logic to work with it, and our relationship building. And I specifically want to speak about empathy because there is a myth that neurodivergent people are not capable of empathy, and that is not true. So it's just that neurodivergent empathizing looks very different to the predominant neurotype of expression of empathy. So both of these are equally valid, but they equally misunderstand each other a lot of the time, because if what you're expecting to see is one thing and that's not what you see, you don't know that there's another way of doing it. That's why we need to be informed on this. Neurodivergent people bear the burden almost all of the time, though, to meet the expectations of the predominant neurotype behavior norms, which is unfair because it should be a two-way street, right? Empathy is a two-way street anyway. So predominant neurotype norms are not inherently better or more correct. They're just, as I said, society is set up to expect those, as opposed to expecting neurodivergent norms for what empathy looks like. There is a lot of discussion in the neurodivergent world around this. It's known as the double empathy problem, and there is an onus on both neurodivergent and on neurotypical people to try to understand that empathy doesn't always look like the same thing, and to try to understand each other. So the important thing here, there is not one correct or appropriate way for someone to behave in relation to another person's emotional state. An unconditional positive regard should be offered to all children, neurodivergent children and neurotypical children. That we shouldn't be trying to make neurodivergent children behave in a way that is only appropriate for a neurotypical child. So in direct reference to the tool of the profile wheel, the aim of the wheel is to gain perspective on a neurodivergent child's internal experience. It is not to tell them that their innate way of being is wrong or inappropriate, or to force them to change their behavior to comply with predominant neurotype norms. So what does emotional development support need look like? Bigger or smaller reactions than you'd expect, struggling to explain what you're feeling, frequently saying their tummy hurts or feels funny, but not knowing what that means, not kind of making a connection, confusion about why a family member is upset, so being able to see it but not understand what's happening, having a sudden, and the word sudden, of course, we know that means that there's been a lot of stuff building up to that, but it could look like a sudden external meltdown, or suddenly going very quiet and having an internal shutdown. It very frequently in classrooms and at home looks like young people hiding under tables or in the toilets to avoid situations, kind of going completely physically rigid in an unexpected situation, kind of looking frozen, retreating to the inside of a cupboard at home when visitors arrive, or always asking to stay home from school on PE days or on assembly days, things like that. And so why might this be happening? Well, there's very frequently, there's a lack of explicit explanation about these situations. Adults assume that a child knows what it means when they say things that are more metaphorical, like to stand in a line, without ever having explained it, because we think, well, you'll have picked it up, you've seen it done, you know what it means, but not always. So we need to be a little bit more explicit about that. And there is a lot around change to the expected schedule, and life is about unexpected change, right? But when we're still working on our emotional development skills, and when we're neurodivergent and we require that kind of expectation in order to feel safe, because remember, the amygdala is telling us that we're not safe. So if there's an unexpected change, that is a threat. So then you're going to see an emotional response to that. You're going to see a fight, flight, freeze, fawn response to that. You could be having difficulty with your sleep. And obviously, we all know that sleep is important for everybody to feel capable of managing their emotions. That's no different for neurodivergent people. And neurodivergent people tend to have more trouble falling asleep. So they are more likely to get less restorative sleep. There are misinterpretations of events for like over applying understanding. So for example, shouting means being angry, but actually sometimes shouting is just about making sure your voice is heard over a long distance. But if you are saying, well, I know that shouting means angry, you could be misinterpreting what's going on, and that could have you in a highly heightened emotional state. Dietary needs, again, we know lots of our neurodivergent young people experience avoidant and restrictive food intake. They might not have enough of certain nutrients or vitamins or minerals or things, and that's a very real challenge. And so that could also be impacting your ability to sleep and your ability to develop. There are past traumatic experiences. For most neurodivergent people, life is traumatizing in lots of ways that neurotypical people wouldn't understand or have kind of the perspective on. And so you kind of carry those traumatic experiences with you into the next one. That's your amygdala telling you, see, we weren't safe the last time, so we're not going to be safe this time. And then masking will impact that as well. So if you're trying to mask in a certain environment, then when you're out of that environment, all of the emotions that you were hiding will come out on you. There's no getting away from them. And lack of experience with a new situation, and then particularly alexithymia as it relates to our emotional state and how that's tied to interoception, which is in our sensory state. This is not an exhaustive list. These are just things that, again, for me, came right to the top of my mind about my personal experience and my experiences with my children, other things and things that I've seen firsthand. There could be an expression of emotional need that I've not seen myself. It doesn't mean that it's not an emotional need that needs to be supported. We need to just be looking at the observable evidence and trying to understand what could be driving that. So our key takeaways from emotional. Emotional development happens in stages. First, we're doing intrapersonal emotional development, then interpersonal emotional development happens. It impacts our self-awareness, our social awareness, our relationship building, our emotional regulation, and our executive function decision-making. And there is the best way to support it is to give clear and explicit direction, to be child-centered, to be affirming and strengths-focused, to be consistent, validating, and curious. Again, we use the wheel to gain perspective on a neurodivergent child's internal experience, not to force them to change their behavior to comply with neurotypical norms. And to sensory. We're just flying today. Sensory development. All human experience has a sensory element. So this is a fairly big area for us for understanding, because we are never going to get away from the sensory impact of our environment, either internal and external. Our sensory development allows us to learn about the world around us and in us. And a lot of the time we kind of ignore the in us part of that. And I'm going to focus mostly on that today. The information we take in is called input. That comes in from the senses all over our body. And when it's taken in, it's called registration, like when it's understood. And then it's processed, organized, and utilized. And that's called integration. So there's an input, we register it, it gets integrated. Our experience of that input in that moment determines how we will respond to what we take in, and that results in our response or our output. And then following on from responses or from our output are the results and the outcomes. So we will respond in a way, in a specific way, and then there will be an outcome from that. Sensory integration happens all together, all at once. It's not isolated. There is loads of overlap, and the different senses impact each other, and they impact the total sensory integration. It's cumulative, and that's what we need to really be thinking about in terms of supporting young people. It is a cumulative impact. It's not just that brightness right now has led them to have a meltdown. There has been other stuff going on. It is important to note that cumulative impact happens for all brains, but neurodivergent brains are more likely to respond with amygdala hijack to sensory input. We also all have fluctuating capacity, and that's because there are lots of different factors in any given day that impact how we're able to integrate something and respond to it. So that means that the same inputs will not always get the same responses. Sensory responses are dynamic. And also, because they're dynamic, it's important to note that sensory responses are not active choices, especially if someone is already in amygdala hijack. If you're already in your I'm trying to survive space in your mind, you're not using your prefrontal cortex to make a decision. And that's very important to understand in terms of how we look at a young person's observable behavior and try to understand how we can support them. If it's not an active choice how we respond, then we can't respond to the outcome of that response with punishment or discipline. We're never going to change the response by punishing somebody for how their innate response went. It's not an active choice. So the result of that is not an active choice. You'll see here in the graphics that I've showed the panda bear from NeuroWild there, and it's showing that capacity has fluctuated. There was an unexpected situation for that panda, and so this was an emotional one, but you can see how it all builds up there. This sensory overload is kind of pushed over the edge and into meltdown, I'm going to say there, because it's very observable. So the only way that we can make positive changes in these situations is to understand that internal experience and to put in relevant support for those internal experiences. We're not going to punish the automatic response out of somebody. We have to figure out how we can avoid the sensory overload that put them in that position in the first place. I want to mention specifically about the overreacting, because that gets said a lot about neurodivergent people. Neurodivergent people are not overreacting. They're reacting differently than neurotypical people. If you think again that we're not pruning all of our synaptic connections the same way that a neurotypical brain is, there's a lot more coming in at us that we're processing and that we're dealing with. And so it may not be a big deal to you, but it doesn't mean it's not a big deal to us. It doesn't mean that it's not having a stronger impact on us than it is having on you. We tend to experience things pretty intensely. And that comes on the back of also having been traumatized. And so in a trauma-informed sort of understanding way, we have to look at the cumulative impact of all of these experiences on somebody and how that could result in a response to a sensory input. And noting that the world is very often completely dysregulating for any number of reasons. So it is cumulative, is what I'm saying, and neurodivergent people react differently to these inputs than neurotypical people. Our brains operate differently, very, very fundamentally operate differently, because we may filter out more or less information than a neurotypical brain. A neurotypical brain will filter out about 95% of the sensory information it takes in. Neurodivergent brains do not do that. So the filtering process is what impacts our arousal level. Our arousal level is what is telling us how our body should respond in a situation. Are we hyper aware? Are we hypo aware? Our body is trying to figure out how conscious we need to be of the danger around us, basically. And this will always impact our personal capacity that I was talking about, the kind of fluctuating capacity, and it will inform our responses to sensory input. And obviously then this impacts all areas of daily life, our mental well-being, and the way we communicate, socialize, and learn. So generally, we all know about the 5 senses that are external, that sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. But internally, we also have vestibular, proprioception, and interoception, and I want to spend time on those. Specifically on interoception as it relates to alexithymia, as I was talking about in the emotional area just before this. So alexithymia is being unable to kind of differentiate or understand your own emotions and being able to explain them, or even being able to separate them from physical reactions. So being hungry but actually feeling sad, or thinking you feel sad but actually you're hungry. Interoception is the underlying source of the experience of alexithymia, and very many neurodivergent people experience alexithymia, which then, as you can understand, kind of disconnects you from what is actually going on around you. This interoceptive disconnection significantly impacts all elements of well-being. And that disconnection is heightened by non-affirming supports. They further that disconnection from our interoceptive sense by telling us, well, no, actually, you're not feeling that. What you're feeling is this. So then we stop trusting ourselves. We stop believing what we think our body is telling us. In order to have sensory regulation, we need to have better control of our interoceptive sense, or understanding of our interoceptive sense. And it's important to note before that a regulated neurodivergent person will look different to a regulated neurotypical person. When we're talking about regulation, what we want is somebody who's able to focus their attention, who feels emotionally balanced, who's in an internal state of arousal that is appropriate to the context of what they're doing, to their task at hand, who's feeling comfortable in the situation they're in, and able to, like sensory-wise, environment-wise, and able to transition to other activities in a positive way. The way a neurodivergent person does that looks very different to the way a neurotypical person does that. So when we're saying that we want kids who are good learners in the classroom, for a neurodivergent person, that almost never means sitting still with their hands in their lap and making eye contact. That's just not comfortable, and it doesn't allow us to be regulated. Okay, so what might sensory support need look like? Bigger or smaller reactions than you'd expect, struggling to explain what they're feeling, lots of tipping upside down in my house anyway, standing and pacing while watching TV. You can see there's a huge list here of possible support need appearance. And that's because we're all sensory beings, and every experience has a sensory element. And so however a young person is behaving in a situation, there's probably some sort of sensory input there that we need to be looking at. If their behavior is atypical, that's totally okay. It's totally okay to be tipping upside down if that's what is working for you. We're only concerned with changing behavior related to sensory need when it's harmful to themselves or dangerous to others. And so if there are ways that we can manage to allow them to be doing the same thing in a safer way, that's something that we would definitely want to do. For example, I have chewing their shirt collar there. I know lots of neurodivergent children chew the collars right off their shirts. And so for a number of reasons, that's not safe. It's a choking hazard. There's, whatever. So we need to provide them something that allows them to chew because they're needing to chew, but in a way that is safe for them and safe for others. So key takeaways from sensory. All humans are sensory beings with fluctuating capacity. Sensory processing is how we learn about the world around us and in us. Sensory responses are not active choices. They reflect the individual's current capacity level and their internal experience of the sensory input. Interoception is the key to connectedness and self-regulation. We need to know what's going on inside us in order to be able to manage our world around us. And support should always be affirming of the internal experience. So on to how we can help. So that's kind of more like theory. In terms of practical supports, what can we do? Well, number one, what we can do is always use neurodiversity affirming practice. We're going to be informed by neurodivergent voices and what they're telling us. We're not going to try to tell neurodivergent people that what they're doing is wrong and they need to be doing what neurotypical people do. Aside from anything else, it's setting them up for failure because they're never going to be neurotypical. But it also leads to self-esteem and self-image issues if we're doing that. We're going to presume competence in all areas. We're going to promote autonomy. This is the individual's life, not ours. And we're going to respect all types of communication styles while we use our strength-based approach that is tailored to individual support needs. Affirming support looks like allowing people to be themselves, basically. So in this situation here, we've got a teacher saying to the students there, is everyone set up in a way that helps them listen? Great. There's lots of different strategies going on. Everyone deserves, or everyone should be feeling happy and safe in here. And that's what affirming support looks like. Is everybody feeling safe and comfortable? Excellent. Let's move on to the learning activity. As a parent, the most important thing we can do is prioritize our child's happiness, comfort, and well-being and stand up for them when other people try to place neurotypical demands on them. Because if they're not neurotypical, they're never going to meet that standard. And all we're going to do is hurt them by trying to make them meet neurotypical standards. Particularly NeuroWild here gives us this great example of lightening the load. And the best way to support our neurodivergent kids is to help them manage the load of expectation that's on them. So you can see there that there's a little girl in a boat and she's got a bag that says lagging skills in it that's kind of like weighing her down. And there's an adult on the land who is removing things from that boat to try to help her be able to manage things better. And the adult is saying, let me help you, sweetheart. And she's removing emotional dysregulation, sensory dysregulation, and neurotypical expectations from that boat. So that child will be able to develop their skills better in an environment that isn't being weighted down by these other issues. So how do we lighten the load? We learn about their sensory preferences and we provide appropriate accommodations. We help our child regulate when they're experiencing big emotions, so we co-regulate with them. which is incredibly helpful when we're trying to model that behavior, but also to let them know that they're safe and there's someone that they can rest in. And we're not going to let people hold our children to neurotypical expectations, because all we're doing then is preventing them from being their best selves. Specifically, in supports now, I'm going to go back and talk about everything kind of together, because a lot of these supports overlap. But for specific supports for executive functioning, for example, there's chunking information to make it more manageable, and providing predictable routines, giving lots of visual supports, or other tangible supports. So that can be pictorial, it can be a written checklist, it can be a script of I'm going to say this and they're going to say that, but like actually written out so that you kind of can refer to it as you're going. There can also be auditory cues for, like, this music plays. Lots of teachers do this in primary school. They play a certain song and that means it's time to tidy up and things like that. So it does it in a way that doesn't create confrontation. It's just the music plays, you become aware of it, you start doing the next step. Warnings can also be helpful for that, but in a way that is right for the child. So just putting up a countdown clock might not be the right support, because a countdown clock might be completely terrifying, right? That the time is counting down and you're running out of time. There are many neurodivergent young people who, once there's a countdown clock, all they can do is stare at it and watch the time disappear. So we have to actually be thinking about what that is right for that young person. We can walk through an activity or situation step by step to support understanding. And this is something that you will find that, because we need to explicitly teach most of these skills, not just rely on observation and experience. We need to specifically teach them. That can be something that you'll do way more than you think you might need to. Showing somebody how to make toast could end up being like many weeks long process until they feel comfortable with it. But our role is to provide that support until the person feels comfortable with it. And to not expect them to be able to do it because other people can do it after only 3 times or whatever. Particularly important with executive functioning is demonstrating how to put thoughts together to create a new understanding. And this is slow and deliberate work, because as I said before, there can be an over application of a rule for, if it's a rule in this situation, that it might be a rule in this situation, like the shouting. So we have to show that actually this thought plus this thought equals this thought. And so even if thought A is the same in the second situation, it's not thought B anymore, it's thought C, right? And how we put those things together to come up with new understanding. And the support use of problem-solving scripts and things like that, like I already said. And then using technology where appropriate to ease pressures. So I've put some app things in there. There's Habit Rabbit and Goblin Tools, which I speak more specifically about in the cognitive presentation, the other video. But those are tools for supporting you to break down bigger tasks into smaller tasks, or to kind of provide a personal motivation for achieving a self-care task, for example, that wouldn't necessarily be there otherwise, that it's doing something else for you as well. Specific emotional supports, and these are a little more, this is like an overview of how we support emotional development. Most importantly, we're never telling a young person what they should be feeling, or that how they're feeling is wrong. We want to guide them to understand themselves, to be able to identify that for themselves, and then so further on they can advocate for themselves. So we're going to be strengths focused rather than deficit correcting. We're going to ensure that there are trusted adults around the young person who are attuned to their needs, but also who the child knows that they can depend on, that they can rest in. We're going to provide a consistent approach in all areas of the child's world and validate their internal experience, demonstrating getting curious to understand oneself, modeling how you acknowledge your own emotions. So talking about that process for yourself, like, I'm feeling sad right now. I think that's why my stomach feels a little bit heavy, like talking about what your experience is so that they know it's okay to talk about their experience. When we're seeing that they're overwhelmed by emotional dysregulation or sensory dysregulation, then we can change the environment physically and emotionally. We can reduce those unnecessary stressors. We can lighten that load. Part of that can be providing predictable routines, but also working with them to provide kind of, if a change has to happen, this is the way that it will happen, like trying to give them the safety structure that they need. Absolutely practicing co-regulation, and then always kind of asking ourselves, what can I do differently to support this child? Specifically around sensory, I didn't talk about this in the sensory presentation last week, and so I want to make sure to talk about it now. The graphic, how do we prevent this from boiling over? This graphic is so perfect for me because we're constantly putting our children on the burner, right? And turning it up so that it can fully boil, and then expecting them to know how to manage that when they've got a lot of stuff going on. And really, how do you fix that? Well, you take the pan off the burner, right? Like, we can physically change their environment. We can get them out of that environment if necessary. We can reduce the heat by removing unnecessary pressures. We can't expect them to not boil over when we've put them in a situation that demands that they do. So generally speaking, for sensory supports, we have to be looking at, how do we change what this young person is experiencing so they don't get so distressed that they end up melting down, shutting down, hiding, right? They're telling us something. They're telling us that there's an unmet need. It's our job to figure out what that need is when they're not able to express it directly. And all of our supports should always be affirming, never deficit-based. So we're going to consider the child's environment from a sensory perspective at different times of day in different situations, because, like, for example, the gym hall when they're having PE is one place, but it's a completely different place when you're having assembly. And so what are the different sensory and social expectations in those situations? How are those impacting on their ability to handle the sensory inputs? We're going to use our practical support aids and strategies, the visual timetables, things that help things make more tangible whenever possible. We're going to do our model body talk, our interoception talk, where we're saying, oh, right now my head feels fuzzy. I wonder if that's because I'm feeling a little nervous or whatever, so that we're modeling that and encouraging them to, and also that we're encouraging self-awareness and body curiosity for them, so that they can say, oh, you know what, my tummy feels fluttery. I wonder what that means. We're going to be trying to give them that vocabulary deliberately and explicitly so that they can wonder about that for themselves and try to understand it. And we're going to validate their inner experience. Specific ideas. There's a wide range here of what we can cover for all areas of our sensory input experience, particularly around vestibular proprioception and interoception. We want to be doing all that stuff I was just talking about for interoception. For proprioception, we need to be using our muscles and getting that muscle use, that heavy muscle work, something that allows you to feel all of your muscles and tendons and the parts of your bodies coming together. That's what proprioception is looking for. And for vestibular, that's our balance. And it's also what is our increases or decreases our arousal level. So we rock a baby to sleep because our vestibular, when it's rocked, gets soothed. And when we jump up and down, we get hyper, like, because we're making that vestibular stimulated. So there are very specific ways that we can utilize this information in order to best support our young people to meet their support or the expectations of the environment that they're in. I really want to highlight that there should also be sensory recharge. Whenever we're talking about sensory experience, there's also going to be, I said you can't get away from it, right? So if you've had to take in a whole bunch of input that you're having difficulty processing and integrating, then we also need to give you the space to be able, the space and the time, the physical space, the literal space, but the metaphorical space also, to process that to get it all into place so that you can move forward again, because we said we want regulation as part of that is being able to transition to the next activity. So we want to be able to give that space to allow a person to get where they need to be in their head and in their body to be able to move on to the next activity. Whew. Okay, so that's all 3 areas. If you have questions or you need support, these are our contact details as always. And just get in touch and we will do our best.